Welcome to the Joe Ligato Show. I'm your host, Dr. Joe Ligato, and we'll be answering a question from the audience today on what are the implications of China's rise for the future of the global system. And I have 5 main points I want to cover here. One implication is that China provides alternative models of growth. And I'm not just talking about every other country implementing the Chinese way of growing. I'm talking about the fact that China, unlike America or the Soviet Union, they didn't really care if other countries do the same thing as China. In fact, they would go so far as to say China is unique and you probably shouldn't copy China's system because it works in the Chinese culture with the Chinese system. And so the Chinese model of growth is not only allowing other countries to emulate the Chinese model of growth, but they're allowing other countries to have their own models of growth. And so China's rise unlocks all those alternative models of growth that were previously not allowed. If you wanted to be successful, you had to do it in a Western way. One reason for that was because of the fact that everyone just kind of assumed that since the West was all the nations that were modernized became westernized. Even places like South Korea and Japan became very westernized in order to modernize. And so, to a large extent, countries for a long time thought that modernization and westernization were synonyms. Well, China provided an alternative to that. They showed that you could modernize without necessarily westernizing. And that unlocks something in people's brains, within the brains of people within nations, and that was that other forms of modernization could occur. And China allows for those other forms of modernization. And so these countries are looking at, is there a Muslim Arabic way of modernizing? Is there a Russian way of modernizing? That's something that Russia has had to think a lot about, which was, for the longest time, they've looked to Western Europe and said, we want to be like Western Europe. Well, now Russia is saying, actually, we want to be our own thing, and we have our own culture, and we're proud of that, and we're going to figure out how can we further modernize our nation, given the Russian civilizational roots of the nation. And I think a lot of countries are going to take that stance nowadays, and that's something that's been completely unlocked because of China's rise. Another thing is that there are implications of China's rise for the future of the global system in the rise of civilization states. I talked about this a little bit earlier, talking about Russian civilization, but for the longest time, Western civilization was suppressing, was overshadowing other civilizational states, such as the Russian civilization and such as the Chinese civilization. And we're seeing more and more that these other civilizations are starting to rise. That the Muslim civilization, which made huge strides throughout the kind of Middle Ages time, and they had a lot of advances, they kind of fell behind after the Industrial Revolution. But a lot of people, and I'm sure even a lot of Muslims, thought that just meant their system was stagnant. It wasn't meant for the modern world. Well, now we're realizing that these various civilization states can have their own form of modernization, and various Muslim countries, various Arabic countries are looking and saying, how can we modernize? How can we modernize in a distinctly Arabic or distinctly Muslim way? And you saw this with the President Assad's speech a few days ago, where President Assad was talking about the Arab world. He was at the Arab League when talking about this and talking about Arabic civilization and how it can be a counterbalance to Western civilization. And the rise of China really allowed that to occur. It unlocked within these nations the idea that we have civilization states, and not only do we have these civilization states, but they're kind of under attack by the West. And so how do we fight against this influence of the Western juggernaut, this Western civilizational behemoth that is both at the same time diluting its own system but also expanding to encompass the entire world? And so that's another thing that the rise of China helped to influence. A third thing is a third implication of China's rise for the future of the global system is we're seeing that collectivism is now beating individualism on the world stage. We thought for the longest time that the more individualized a nation is and its people are, that the more successful the system is. But China is showing that, again, there are alternative models for growth. You don't have to just look out for yourself in order to have a functioning system that where people advance and the nation advances. China is showing that you can have a tight collectivistic culture and you still can advance as a nation and can rise as a nation. And that's a huge deal. I think that individualism, and I'm going to talk about this in future segments, I think individualism is an aberration. It's an abomination. It's something that should not have occurred. It's something that occurred really since the Age of Enlightenment, and it's had, I would say, detrimental consequences for civilization as a whole and people's bonds within civilization. And you're seeing kind of, I mean, we call it late stage capitalism now, all the failings of modern Western society, but I would say you're seeing late stage individualism within Western society, and it's horrendous. But we could talk about that more in future segments. Another implication of China's rise for the future of the global system is that it's a different type of superpower. I don't know how else to put this, but I came up with the phrase introspective superpower, and that is that China, for all of its history, has focused on its own internal problems. It's built a wall on its northern border. It just hasn't wanted to be bothered by other countries. It's wanted to develop its own nation, and so I'm calling it the introspective superpower. And because of that, you have to wonder, how is China going to interact with the world when it doesn't want to colonize the world like the United Kingdom? It doesn't want to establish a ton of bases throughout the world and just kind of like bully it like the United States. Like what happens when the major superpower within the world just kind of wants to focus on its own internal matters, and its only real interactions with other countries is to trade with them? And that's going to change how things are. I think it's going to change it for the better, but it's still a very unique situation. Like, United States before World War I was trying to be isolationist, but really it had a lot of ties to Western Europe, and so it was hard to be fully isolationist. But China doesn't have those ties. It's like if it wants to be an introspective power throughout its time as the global superpower, it absolutely can't. And so that's something to think about in the future. Like, what does that mean when the strongest nation in the world only really leaves its borders to trade with you? I think that's a good thing for the other nations of the world, but it's something that we should think about further. And the final implication of China's rise for the future of the global system is China talks about this a lot, and I've been talking about this for over a decade, but win-win cooperation. United States has really gone into the habit of winning at the expense of other nations, or if United States can't win, they would rather just both sides lose, so lose-lose situations. And China really does seem to like win-win cooperation because they understand that interactions with other nations, it's iterative. So if you treat another nation poorly now, they're going to remember that. There is historical memory there, and they're not going to want to cooperate with you in the future. They're not going to be benevolent towards you. They're going to try to get one over you as much as possible. And so China doesn't want to participate in that. They don't want to create that bad blood. Maybe this goes back to that introspective superpower thing where it's like, they don't really want to have to deal with countries outside of their borders. And so they don't want to create that animosity that would force them to look abroad, look external to their nation. Really, the only reason I think China even looked external to their own nation was because of the century of humiliation and how countries like the United Kingdom were importing drugs into China against the Chinese government's will at the time. And so China really is looking for this win-win cooperation because they don't want to have difficulties with other nations. They really do want to just kind of like focus on their own matters. And so these are kind of 5 points that I would touch upon about the implications of China's rise for the future of the global system. So if you liked what I said and want to hear more from me, please like and subscribe to this video and stick around because we have more questions and answers. We have more live streams, more recordings that I'll be doing. So thank you for listening in, and I'll be back for future segments later.